The relay station had no name. That was the first thing Overseer Keth Vaughn noticed when he pulled the incident file. Not the debris field it was cataloging, not the energy signature that had triggered the automated alert, but the absence of a designation in the header field where every registered installation in the Concord's territory carried a unique identifier string going back 400 years of meticulous record-keeping. Someone had built something in Concord space and had not bothered to name it. He almost closed the file. He almost didn't. The energy signature was the wrong shape. Keth Vaughn had spent 31 years as a Concord Hyperlane overseer, which meant he had spent 31 years understanding, at a level most sentient beings never needed to approach, that the geometry of faster-than-light travel was not a technology. It was a discovery. The Hyperlanes existed before the Concorde. They existed before any of the 7 founding species had achieved spaceflight. They were geological features of spacetime, as permanent and as inarguable as the mass of a star, and the entirety of interstellar civilization, trade, communication, military deployment, colonization, was built on the simple fact that you could only go where the lanes already went. This was not a limitation anyone complained about. You did not complain about gravity. The energy signature in the file was 4.7 seconds long. It had the spectral profile of a Hyperlane entry event, the specific electromagnetic shear pattern that occurred when a vessel compressed local spacetime to thread into an existing lane. Keth Vaughn had reviewed thousands of these. He had written 3 academic papers on their classification. This one was in the wrong place. Not slightly wrong, not a rounding error in the coordinate system. The nearest mapped Hyperlane terminus was 2.3 light-years from the event location. A vessel generating a lane entry signature 2.3 light-years from the nearest lane was not a navigation error. It was something that could not happen. He flagged it routine. He went home, he did not sleep. 3 days later, a second signature appeared. Same spectral profile, different location, still 2.3 light-years from any mapped lane terminus, but in a direction from the first event that formed when plotted against Concord star charts, a perfectly straight line aimed at the Vethara system. Vethara was a human colony. Keth Vaughn pulled every record on the humans he had access to, which was considerable, because he had overseer clearance, and because the Concorde had been watching the humans with the particular attention one gives to something that has not yet clarified what kind of problem it will become. They had been admitted to the Concorde's outer registry 14 years ago, which was the tier reserved for species that had achieved hyperlane navigation, but had not yet demonstrated the economic output, military restraint, or diplomatic coherence necessary for full membership. In practice, the outer registry was a waiting room. Species spent between 40 and 200 years there, acclimating, trading, slowly integrating into the lane network under supervision. The Concorde allocated them access rights, specific lanes, specific termini, specific transit windows. In exchange, those species agreed not to build independent navigation infrastructure. The humans had signed that agreement 11 years ago. The signatures were in space that the humans were not authorized to transit. "They are testing a drive system," said Legate Sorvantha when Keth Vaughn presented his findings to the Hyperlane Authority's oversight panel. Sorvantha was Dravathi, which meant she was 300 years old and had the particular kind of patience that very old beings develop when they have watched younger civilizations make the same mistakes repeatedly. Some variation on compression geometry. They have miscalibrated it. The events are failed attempts at lane insertion. The vessels are probably destroyed. "The events are 4.7 seconds long," Keth Vaughn said. "A failed insertion is instantaneous. Then they are producing a sustained compression event before the failure. Both events, 3 days apart, are exactly 4.7 seconds long." Sorvantha looked at him. The panel was quiet. "Consistent failures," one of the junior assessors offered. Consistent something, Kethvon said. The panel ruled. Increased monitoring, formal inquiry to the Human Outer Registry Office. No escalation pending response. Kethvon filed the ruling and went back to watching his instruments. A week later, a third signature appeared. Same duration, same spectral profile, forming a perfectly straight line through the first two events, still aimed at Vethara, now close enough to Vethara that the geometry was unmistakable. They were not failing, they were building. The formal inquiry to the Human Outer Registry Office received a response in 11 days, which was fast by diplomatic standards and which said, in its entirety, the events in question are classified under the Human Consolidated Authority's Sovereign Experimental Research Provisions, subsection 7, which permits member species of the Outer Registry to conduct non-transit research activities in unclaimed space within their allocated corridor zones. All activities are in compliance with Outer Registry membership terms. We appreciate the Concord's attentiveness. Kethvon read it 4 times. Then he pulled up the actual text of subsection 7. They were right. Technically, the space where the events occurred was within the human allocated corridor, and subsection 7 did permit experimental research, and the provision had been written 2 centuries ago when the Concord's legal scholars were thinking about telescope arrays and gravitational survey equipment, not whatever this was. He forwarded the response to Sorvantha with a single attached note. They anticipated this question before we asked it. She did not respond for 2 days. When she did, her message contained 4 words: expand the monitoring net. The woman's name was Dr. Lena Vasquez, and she had been awake for 31 consecutive hours when the third anchor point held. She didn't celebrate. She pressed both hands flat against the edge of the console and breathed. Around her, in the cramped operations bay of a converted mining surveyor that smelled permanently of recycled air and burnt coffee, 6 other people also breathed, or exhaled, or in the case of her navigation lead, made a sound that was technically a word but too rough to parse. Anchor integrity, she said. Holding at 94.2. That was Tamaz, her navigator, reading from the secondary display because the primary had developed a flicker 2 weeks ago and they hadn't had time to fix it. Variance is within the model. The model said 94.2 would hold. The model said 90 to 97 would hold, so yes. Good, she straightened up. Her back made a sound she chose not to think about. Pull the team off the compression rig. We need 6 hours of sleep before we attempt the first traverse. We haven't mapped the full path yet, said Yui from the far console. Yui was the youngest of them, 26, and had the specific kind of exhaustion that young people get when they realize that the extraordinary thing they believed in is actually becoming real, and the weight of that is heavier than they expected. I know, Lena said. That's why we're sleeping first. No one argued. They were all too tired. This was the point where human beings who had been awake too long stopped arguing and started making dangerous mistakes, and Lena had built her team's operating procedures around the brutal understanding that she was not exempt from this. None of them were. She went to her bunk. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and looked at the data she already knew by memory, 3 anchor points, each one a fixed compression node permanently embedded in local spacetime, each one taking 11 weeks to build, each one consuming the entire power output of their ship's reactor for the duration plus the stored energy of 14 emergency cells. Each one absolutely not possible according to any published theory of hyperlane physics. According to published theory, hyperlanes could not be created. They were found, not made. According to Lena's dissertation, which had been rejected by 4 journals and accepted by one very small one that her supervisor had described as admirably open-minded, the existing lanes were not geological features of spacetime. They were geological features of spacetime asterisk that had already been used. The compression geometry wasn't inherent. It was a record, a groove worn deep enough by some earlier civilizations' transit events that it had become self-sustaining. The implication, which had been the reason 4 journals rejected the paper, was that grooves could theoretically be cut. If you had enough energy, if you had enough time, if you could tolerate losing the ship twice during the anchor tests, which they had, and rebuilding from salvage and continuing, and losing 3 crew members to an anchor cascade in the second series, which they had, and continuing, and spending the better part of 11 years in spaces the Conquered had decided to watch more closely without understanding why it felt the need to. She slept. Keth Vaughn received the 4th signature at 300 local station time, and it was different. It was not a compression buildup. It was not the 4.7-second pulse pattern he had come to recognize. It was a sustained shear event, the exact electromagnetic profile of a vessel in transit through a hyperlane, in a location where no hyperlane existed. It lasted 42 seconds. He called Sorvantha. "I see it," she said before he could speak. Her voice had changed. "I see it, and I don't know what to tell you." "They transited." "Nothing transited. There's no lane there." "Something transited," Keth Vaughn said. "The signature is." "I know what the signature is." A pause, long enough that he checked whether the channel was still active. "Get me everything you have on the human drive team. Personnel, funding, publications, everything. The human authority will block any formal." "I didn't say formally." He got her everything he had. What she found, what she eventually shared with him, 2 weeks later, in a meeting that did not appear on any official schedule, changed the shape of what he thought was happening. "Her name is Vasquez," Sorvantha said. "She brought up a publication record. She published a theoretical paper 11 years ago, before the humans signed the registry agreement, a single paper in a minor journal. The paper argued that hyperlanes are not permanent features of spacetime, that they are instead records," Keth Vaughn said slowly. "How did you?" "Because that's what the anchor signatures look like. They're not building a drive, they're building a lane. They've been inscribing it point by point over 3 years." Sorvantha set down the document she was holding. For a moment, she was simply an old being who had just understood something she had not been prepared to understand. "The paper was rejected by peer review," she said. "The Concord's own scientific advisory attached a formal rebuttal." "The Concord's scientific advisory," Keth Vaughn said carefully, "was working from the assumption that the existing lanes are permanent and ineradicable, a foundational assumption." "Yes. Because for 400 years, no one has been able to modify or create one." "Yes." "Have we ever," Keth Vaughn said, "systematically tried? Or did we simply decide it wasn't possible and stop looking?" The silence in the room was a different quality than any silence he had experienced in 31 years of bureaucratic meetings. It was the silence of a very large thing shifting its weight. "The humans," Sorvantha said finally, "lost 2 ships testing this." "Yes." "They continued." "Yes." "They lost crew members." 3 confirmed, possibly more. She stood, walked to the display showing the Concord's lane map, 400 years of survey work, 31,000 mapped termini, the skeleton on which all interstellar civilization was hung. "What is the current transit count on the new lane?" 17 traversals in the last 11 days. 17. Her voice was level in the way that things are level when great effort is being applied to make them level. And where does it go? This was the question Keth Vaughn had been waiting to answer, because the answer was the part he did not fully understand. And the part he did not fully understand was the part that had kept him from sleeping well for 2 weeks. "Vethara," he said. "The lane connects 2 points in the human-allocated corridor. It is not, technically, in violation of their registry agreement. But the lane doesn't end at Vethara. The compression geometry continues past the terminal anchor. There is a propagation vector, Sorvantha turned. The lane they've built has a natural extension point, Kethvon said. Following the inscribed geometry, the path projects forward, past Vethara, past human-allocated space. He brought up the map. The projected line moved through the display in silence. It terminates following the vector at the Orith Junction. Sorvantha went still. Orith Junction was not a colony or a station. Orith Junction was the single most critical hyperlane nexus in the Inner Concord, a natural confluence of 11 major lanes, the hub through which 40% of Concord trade flowed. Control of Orith Junction was why the Drevathi had been the dominant founding species for 2 centuries. It was also, by treaty, closed to outer registry species. They haven't extended it yet, Kethvon said. The propagation vector is just geometry, a possibility, but… How long, Sorvantha said, very quietly, would it take them to extend the lane to Orith Junction from their current terminal point? Kethvon had run this calculation twice, not trusting himself the first time. At the rate they built the initial segment, he said, accounting for the longer distance and assuming the same methodology, he paused. 8 years. 8 years, she sat back down, and we've been watching them for 3. We've been watching the wrong thing for 3 years, he said. We were monitoring for treaty violations. We weren't monitoring for someone rewriting the physics. The Concord's emergency session was not called an emergency session. It was called an extraordinary geometric consultation because the Concord was 400 years old and had a name for everything, and even things that had never happened before could be filed under a pre-existing category if you were sufficiently determined about it. Legate Sorvantha presented the findings. 12 senior delegates from 7 species listened. Kethvon sat in the observers' gallery and watched their faces as Sorvantha explained that a species had been in the outer registry for 14 years, had signed a non-infrastructure agreement 11 years ago, had spent those 11 years quietly and legally carving a new hyperlane through space in a technically compliant corridor, and had in 17 days run more transit traffic through it than the Concord had expected. The Helvari delegates spoke first. The Helvari were the galaxy's finest engineers, which meant they had opinions. This should not be possible. The physical evidence disagrees, Sorvantha said. The energy requirement alone was met by converting their vessel's emergency power cells, all of them, multiple times. They rebuilt the storage system from salvage twice. A pause. They dismantled their own emergency systems, the Helvari delegate said, in the tone of someone identifying a symptom. Repeatedly. They had no evacuation capacity. For the duration of each anchor construction cycle, correct. The room absorbed this. Kethvon watched the delegates absorbing it and thought, they think this is a story about engineering. They were performing astonishment at the technical achievement. They were not yet asking the question he had not stopped asking since the moment he had understood what the humans had done. Not how. Why? Why would you spend 11 years building a thing you were not supposed to build, in plain sight of observers you knew were watching, using a method no civilization in 4 centuries of space travel had ever attempted, accepting a casualty rate that any rational cost-benefit analysis would have caused you to abandon, while simultaneously maintaining perfect technical compliance with every treaty provision so no one could formally stop you? Why would you do all of that to build a road to a place you had been told you couldn't go? He thought about Vasquez. He thought about a woman who had written a paper 4 journals rejected, who had gone out and spent 11 years proving she was right, who had accepted losses that would have ended most programs, who had built her team around the brutal understanding that no one, not her, was exempt from the human tendency to make mistakes when they were broken by exhaustion, who still held. Lena was on her 4th cup of coffee when the Concord docking request came through. And the reason she was on her 4th cup was that 4th cups were what happened on days when you received a communication flagged priority diplomatic at 600 station time after 3 years of official correspondence that had been so precisely and deliberately boring she could have slept through it. The docking request was from a vessel registered to the Concord Hyperlane Authority's Office of Senior Oversight. She accepted the request. She put down the coffee. She told Tamaz. "How bad?" he said. "Unknown. Are we in trouble?" "We are," she said, "in a very specific kind of situation that isn't technically trouble because we haven't technically violated anything." "That's almost reassuring." "Almost." Overseer Kethvon boarded the mining surveyor 40 minutes later. He was tall by Concord standards for Yathani. The Yathani were bipedal, four-limbed, and had the particular physical quality of a species that had evolved in low gravity and then spent several generations adapting to higher gravity environments, which produced individuals who looked simultaneously elongated and carefully braced. He looked around the operations bay with the specific expression of someone who had been forming a mental image of a place for a long time and was now revising it in real time. It was smaller than he'd expected. That much was obvious. "Dr. Vasquez," he said. "Overseer." She offered a hand. He looked at it for a moment. The Yathani didn't shake hands, but he'd clearly read enough about human customs to understand what it meant, because he extended his own and allowed the gesture. "You came personally." The situation seemed to warrant it. "That's polite language for something." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "it is." He walked to the center of the bay and looked at the equipment, the compression rig, the anchor array controllers, the secondary nav console with its flickering display, the wall where someone had taped up a physical star chart with handwritten notations in 3 colors of ink. How many people know the full methodology? "In this room 7, she paused. "Alive 7. He absorbed that. "The paper you published," he said, 11 years ago. "You found it." "It was not difficult to find." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I made sure it was easy to find." This was the moment. She watched him process it. "You published the theory," he said slowly, "before signing the registry agreement." "Yes." "So the theory was public record before the agreement was signed." "Yes." "Which means the Concord's legal office reviewed your publication history during the registry process." "They did." "And did not flag the paper as relevant to the non-infrastructure provisions." "They concluded, I believe, that a theory rejected by peer review and contradicted by 4 centuries of empirical lane data didn't constitute evidence of planned activity." She met his eyes. "They weren't wrong to conclude that. The theory was, at that point, unproven." Kethvon was quiet for a long time. "You published the proof," he finally said, "by building the thing." "Yes." "And because the proof post-dated the agreement, and you built only in compliant space, and the agreement specifies infrastructure rather than research." "We were always within the terms," she said. "We were very careful to be within the terms." 3 years, he said. "I've been watching for 3 years. I watched the anchor constructions. I watched the energy signatures. I watched the traversals." He looked at the wall chart. "I thought I was watching a treaty evasion." "You were watching a research program." "I was watching," he said very carefully, "a species build a door they were told didn't exist, into a room they were told they couldn't enter, using a key they published the blueprint for before anyone thought to take it away." He turned from the chart. "What do you want, Dr. Vasquez?" The question landed plainly. No diplomatic wrapper. She put the coffee mug down. "Access," she said. "Not Orth Junction specifically. Access to the process by which species move from outer registry to full membership without waiting 40 to 200 years in a room that the current members have every incentive to keep you in." She held his gaze. "We're not trying to break the Concord. We're trying to prove that the Concord's assumptions about what we're capable of are wrong. You've already done that. We've proven we can build lanes. We haven't proven they should listen to us about anything else. She paused. Yet. The word landed in the room and sat there. Keth Vaughn looked at the flickering secondary display, at the burn marks on the floor near the compression rig, at the wall chart with 3 colors of handwritten ink, at the coffee mug, at the face of the woman who had spent 11 years being told she was wrong and had responded by building the evidence. The propagation vector, he said, from your terminal anchor, it extends toward Orth Junction. Geometrically, yes. Is that deliberate? She picked up the coffee mug again. Every anchor point in the lane is precisely where the mathematics required it to be, she said. We placed them where the physics placed them. That is not an answer. No, she agreed, it isn't. The Concord's emergency response to what it was now calling the Vasquez lane fell into 3 phases, which Keth Vaughn watched from the position of someone who had been in the institution long enough to understand that institutional response to genuinely novel situations was itself a novel situation, and the Concorde was not good at novelty. The first phase was denial. Several senior delegates maintained for 3 weeks that the lane was unstable, temporary, would collapse under normal transit loads. It did not collapse. It carried an average of 12 human vessels per day and showed no signs of structural degradation. The Helvari engineering team they sent to inspect it came back with a report that used the phrase exceptional precision 7 times and the phrase, I don't understand how, 4 times, which was remarkable language from the Helvari. The second phase was containment. The Concorde issued a formal notice to the human authority requiring disclosure of the full methodology under the scientific cooperation provisions of the Outer Registry Agreement. The human authority disclosed the methodology, all of it, clearly, thoroughly, without redaction, because the methodology, once the lane was built, was no longer the point. The point was the lane. They gave us everything, the Helvari delegate said in the second extraordinary geometric consultation, with an expression Keth Vaughn had never seen on a Helvari face before. Every calculation, every anchor parameter, every energy configuration, it's complete. And, Sorvantha said, and we've had 4 of our engineers attempt to replicate the initial anchor construction, following the exact methodology. Results. A pause. The anchor failed 3 times. On the 4th attempt it held, but only for 6 hours before cascade dissolution. So they cannot replicate it. The mathematics are correct. The physics are correct. Our engineers, he stopped, started again. The process requires tolerating a sustained feedback load during the construction cycle that would cause most standard systems to automatically abort. Our engineers' vessels aborted. They have multiple redundant safety systems that prevented the completion. The human vessel does not have those safety systems, the delegate said, not because they failed to install them, because they removed them. The room was quiet. They deliberately removed the systems that would have protected them, Sorvantha said, in order to tolerate a process that those systems would have prevented. They made themselves more vulnerable, Keth Vaughn said from the observer's gallery, and everyone looked at him, in order to do something that required vulnerability. No one had an answer for that. The third phase was negotiation, and Lena handled it herself, which was not how these things were typically done. Typically you sent diplomats, legal teams, people trained to speak the language of institutional interest. She went anyway, on the grounds that she was the one who understood what had been built and why, and because she had spent 11 years being precise about what she said, and she was not going to hand that precision to someone else now. The negotiation session was held on Concorde Station Yeva, which was beautiful in the way that places become beautiful when 400 years of very old civilizations have been decorating them. all smooth stone and light diffusing panels, and the smell of something that might have been wood. She sat across from Sorvantha, who was the oldest person in the room by several centuries, and who had the quality of patience she had learned from watching lesser civilizations make the same mistakes on repeat. "The propagation vector," Sorvantha said. "We've discussed the propagation vector. I want to discuss it again." Sorvantha folded her hands. "At current lane building rates, how long would it take the human authority to extend the Vasquez lane to Orth Junction?" "I don't discuss hypotheticals in negotiation. This one I'd like you to discuss." Lena was quiet for a moment. 5 years, she said, possibly 4 with a second team. "You could build a second team. We have the methodology. You have the people willing to remove their emergency systems and continue." "Yes," Lena said, "we have those." Sorvantha looked at her for a long time. "What do you want?" It was the same question Kethvon had asked. Lena gave the same answer she had given him, because it was the true answer and it didn't need to be different. Access, genuine access, to the process by which we stop being in the waiting room. And if we expedite the full membership review, then we stop building, Lena said. "We don't need the lane to Orth Junction. We never needed Orth Junction. We built what we built to prove that the waiting room is voluntary, that we're in it because we agreed to be and we can agree to leave." She leaned forward slightly. "The Concord's control of the Hyperlane network is legitimate. We're not arguing that. We're arguing that control granted by physical monopoly is different from control granted by participation, and that the Concord has been operating the first kind while calling it the second." Sorvantha was silent. "We're not here to break anything," Lena said. "We're here because breaking was an option and we chose not to take it." "You're here," Sorvantha said slowly, "because you built a demonstration." "Yes. That was always the plan, not the lane itself, the existence of the capacity." "Yes. You spent 11 years and lost people." Sorvantha's voice shifted, almost imperceptibly. "You lost people building a demonstration." Lena's hands were flat on the table. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady, and Sorvantha heard the cost of that steadiness, which was different from the word itself. The old Drevathi looked at her hands, at the table, at the elegant room that 400 years of civilization had built, at the woman across from her who had spent 11 years making something impossible into a proof, through losses she was still carrying in the flatness of her voice and the weight of her hands. "I need to confer with the full council," Sorvantha said. "I know. This will take time." "We have time," Lena said. "We've been patient before." Kethvon filed his final incident report on the Vasquez lane 14 months after the negotiation concluded. On the same day, the Human Consolidated Authority was formally elevated from outer registry status to provisional full membership, a category the Concord created specifically for this situation, because no existing category fit. The report was thorough. He was always thorough. It documented the initial signatures, the monitoring expansion, the misidentification of anchor construction as failed drive testing, the propagation vector, the methodology disclosure, the Helvari replication failures, the negotiation. He wrote it all in the clean factual language of 32 years of bureaucratic practice, and at the end, in the section marked analysis, he wrote one paragraph that he revised 7 times before he kept it. The human capacity most difficult to account for in this situation is not the engineering methodology, which is extraordinary but follows physical laws. It is the tolerance for sustained disadvantage in pursuit of a long-term position that the subject group had no guarantee they would reach. 2 vessels lost, 3 crew members confirmed dead, emergency systems deliberately removed and not restored for months at a time. The humans were not unaware of the cost. They tracked it, documented it, and continued. The question this office must consider is not whether the humans are capable of rewriting the Hyperlane network. They have demonstrated that they are. The question is, how do you negotiate with something that decides what to want, calculates what it will take to get there, and then simply pays that price without the price changing what it wants? He submitted the report. He sat for a moment at his terminal. He thought about the operations bay, the burn marks on the floor, the wall chart, the 3 colors of ink, the woman with the coffee mug who had spent 11 years being precise about what she said. He thought about what Sorvantha had said in their last conversation before the council vote. They didn't demand access. They demonstrated it was never genuinely denied. That's a different kind of power. The Vasquez Lane was 17 months old now. It was carrying 43 vessels a day through space where no lane had ever run, inscribed into the permanent geometry of spacetime, a groove worn deep by the specific and deliberate and costly belief of a group of people who had been told that what they wanted to build did not exist and had responded by building it. It would not collapse. The Helvari had confirmed that. Lanes once properly inscribed did not collapse. The humans had not extended it toward Orth Junction. They had stopped exactly where they had implied they would stop, which meant Sorvantha had been right. The extension was always leverage, never intention. The lane to Vethara was enough. The lane to Vethara had always been enough. The rest was proof. Keth Vaughn closed the file, opened the monitoring network, looked at the Concord's lane map, 31,000 mapped termini, 400 years of survey, the skeleton of civilization. There was now one lane on the map that was not found. That was made. Made by 7 people in a ship that smelled of recycled air and burnt coffee, who had stripped out their own emergency systems and gone anyway, who had lost people they knew and continued, who had spent 11 years being precisely, deliberately, carefully right about a thing that everyone with authority and credentials and centuries of data told them was wrong. The monitoring net was quiet, no new signatures. He sat with that for a while. Then he began wondering, with the part of his mind that had never fully gone off duty in 32 years, how many other things the humans had concluded didn't exist yet. How many other papers were sitting in minor journals, unproven, waiting for 11 years and the right ship. He thought, the Concorde has 400 years of accumulated answers. He thought, the humans seemed to be working through the questions. And somewhere out past the mapped edge of the network, past the 31,000 termini of the lanes that had always been there, past every limit that 4 centuries of interstellar civilization had decided to accept as permanent, because accepting it was easier than considering whether something permanent had simply never been touched, somewhere in that uncatalogued dark. A small ship with burn marks on its floor and a flickering display, and a wall covered in 3 colors of handwritten ink was running its instruments, and the people inside it were looking at the numbers, and one of them was saying, "Hold on, look at this," and another was asking how long, and someone was calculating, and someone